Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am John Morris. I'm a historian of Japan, and together with my wife, Kamiyama Machiko, we have prepared a presentation on what is first aid to cultural heritage, unraveling how and why saving heritage can save everyone. I will begin my presentation now. First of all, a turning point for rescuing heritage was the Sendai Framework 2015-2020, which linked heritage to DRR. The framework identified cultural resilience of persons as something in which people, governments and other the private sector should invest, because this will do many things, among which saving lives and ensuring an effective recovery and habilitation are very important. Furthermore, it states that public and private sectors need to protect or support cultural and collecting institutions and other sites of historical, cultural heritage and religious interest. After this, heritage workers were able to claim that rescuing heritage should be an important part of any country or anyone's plans for dealing with disasters and other problems. However, how many people really understand this? I would like you to recall the triple disaster that hit Japan on the 11th of March 2011. The earthquake which started the disasters was here, and Machiko and I live here on this red line on the coast. What I'm going to tell you today is a distillation of our experiences, both as specialists working in heritage and in clinical psychology, and also as two disaster survivors. First of all, after the disaster, the Miyagi Shiryo-net, of which I am a member, conducted 105 salvage operations throughout Miyagi Prefecture, which was the area worst affected by the disaster. You can see that many of these operations were conducted on the coast. So, what did Mr. X say to MNS staff when we visited him to offer to rescue his family's historical heritage? People first, you idiots. Not everyone understands the importance of rescuing heritage. Who understand it? These people understand that heritage is important and that it can support people in times of stress. These people also understand that heritage is very important and it can be used and abused as a rationalization for oppression, social division, and dispossession. Remember, we need to remember that heritage has this duality. Who does not understand that heritage is important? In many cases, the people responsible for disaster risk management do not understand or cannot understand why heritage can be important. And we need to be able to explain to them why it is important. So, getting down to fundamentals, why are they relevant? And can culture and cultural heritage save lives? The answer to both questions is yes. The key word here is psychosocial support. Psychological support versus psychosocial support. Psychological support is restricted in scope. It targets people with problems and it can only be done by qualified specialists. And it runs the risks of stigmatizing people with problems as being problem people. On the other hand, psychosocial support, by relieving post-crisis stress, it can save lives. People don't commit suicide. It recognizes that post-crisis stress can best be relieved by connecting people with other people. In other words, psychological support is embedded in social relations, which is why we call it psychosocial support. It provides universal support, can be done by anybody, and can be incorporated into almost any form of relief or support activity. The key concept for understanding psychosocial support is resilience. Individuals, communities exhibit resilience when they adapt to a disturbance of their environment or adapt to adversity. It's adaptation. So it is neither an individual trait, nor it is an ability or kind of strength. And whether resilience develops or not depends on many different systems upon which the individual or community is embedded. In other words, relationships with people and with things, with the environment, all sorts of things. Since there are many different factors which can support resilience, there are many different paths to resilience. FAC cannot save everyone, but that is not a problem. Because resilience depends on the systems which support people. To be effective, psychosocial support must be systemic, integrating or coordinating itself with other concurrent forms of support, and should also be incorporated into the overall planning for disaster risk reduction at all levels. Because there are so many different forms of support to reach all kinds of people, you need many different kinds of support. And linking culture and heritage with psychosocial support will promote resilience, which will then save lives after disasters and promote people's and communities' recovery. Basic texts on psychosocial support, these two. They give clear advice for non-specialists on the do's and don'ts of humanitarian aid. You should read these before you begin any humanitarian aid so that you don't do any harm. Remember, we were also recipients of the aid. Psychosocial support applied to cultural heritage. The basic important text here is ICCROM's First Aid to Cultural Heritage in Times of Crisis. It gives you guiding principles and concrete examples. It is a gold mine of concrete examples. Important principles are that it should be, FAC should be people-centered first aid. You need an inclusive attitude and respect for diversity. You need a context-specific response. There is no single form appropriate response for any context. Because there are so many different contexts, and you need to interlock culture with humanitarian assistance, and please do no harm. Okay, what is the difference between rescuing heritage and first aid to cultural heritage? When you rescue heritage, you focus on the object. For example, this wonderful coffee cup. First aid to cultural heritage, you focus on the object and the people or the relationships that converge or are brought together by the object. In other words, the people behind the object. So another problem is how do you define heritage? The Sendai framework sees heritage as being enshrined in public museums, and also as being something that is designated as heritage. This heritage commonly relates to memory and identity at regional, national, or international levels, i.e., what I call big heritage. But what about the undesignated memories of individuals, families, or local communities, and the repositories of these memories? In other words, little heritage. Which is most important? The question is misleading. The value of heritage is how relevant it is to people's lives and sense of self-identity and place. The big challenge here is to provide an objective evaluation of FAC. Heritage practitioners know from experience that heritage is important. Humanitarian aid workers know from experience that psychosocial support is effective. However, it is very difficult to provide objective third-party data to prove to DRR managers and other people that psychosocial support in general and first aid to heritage in particular provides effective support. A case study of first aid to cultural heritage. Machiko and I have published a paper which provides objective third-party data measuring how the rescue operations of Little Heritage by the Miyagi Shiryo Network provided effective psychosocial support to the owners of the heritage. For details, please refer to the paper. I can't go into the details here because I don't have enough time. Excuse me. Okay, evaluating FHC. Psychologists, Machiko and others, asked owners of private collections of documents to subjectively evaluate their experience of MSN's rescue of their documents. The words owners associated with the rescue experience were subjected to objective quantitative analysis. And throughout the interview process, the informants perceived themselves as active subjects whose opinions and impressions were valued. In other words, the interview process supported their self-respect and dignity. The main takeaways from the paper. Rescuing heritage, in this case, Little Heritage, can be effective social support and promote resilience. This is supported by data. The major factor affecting informants' resilience was the timing of the rescue. Rescues conducted 3 months after the disaster were less effective. In other words, rescuing heritage cannot be left until later. It cannot wait. Conversely, the severity and degree of damage incurred by the owners had little influence on the results. I can't go into the details, but some of them had terrible experiences. The owners were elderly with appropriate psychosocial support. The elderly can become active participants in community recovery. And a third-party evaluation can help heritage workers identify strengths and problem areas. So looking ahead, collaboration between historians and psychologists produced a synergy where the end result exceeded the results of either party working alone. It shows that it is necessary to incorporate FAC into the overall process of disaster risk reduction so that different kinds of aid can dovetail with each other. Doing this will produce better results for all. And some closing words. Why this obsession with disaster risk reduction? The DRR priorities of enhancing economic, social, health, and cultural resilience are relevant to building cohesive, equitable, inclusive societies anywhere, anytime. A society with poor resilience cannot deal effectively with not only disasters, but can't deal with any kind of problem or adversity effectively. And finally, please remember that if you go into a disaster area, aid providers will also suffer severe stress and need support. This is an important but overlooked aspect of psychosocial support, and that's why you need to read Psychological First Aid. Here are essential texts on psychosocial first aid. And further, if you want to understand what resilience really means, I highly recommend these 2 texts. Thank you very much for your attention. Goodbye.